His house was broken into and ransacked several times. In the face of this obvious intimidation, Marco turned time and again to his editor for advice. Eventually he managed to persuade Marco to return for a while to Italy, at least until things had calmed down. He could continue to work for his Parisian magazine from Rome as an overseas correspondent. So, before the worst could happen, Marco left for Rome. He did so with some reluctance, as by now he felt himself to be a Parisian by adoption, but the risk of staying weren't worth running. There was just one thing that made him happy about returning to Rome. Perhaps he would get the chance to meet up with Beatrice. In fact, in the last few letters that he had received from her, she had written that her new relationship was now over. On the airplane, Marco tried to imagine Beatrice would be like now at 24. In his mind he pictured her as beautiful. Incredibly, they had never seen each other again in all the years that had passed. Marco had not warned her of his return to Rome, because he wanted to surprise her and also to see if she would recognize him. Marco was enjoying imagining the scene of their reunion. He knew both where she lived and where she taught. It would not be difficult to find the opportunity for a surprise meeting. On his arrival in Rome, Marco rented a large farmhouse just outside the city. After he had been in Rome for a month, he felt himself reasonably well established. Everything seemed calm, with no trace of threats or attempts on his life. He decided it was time to meet Beatrice. That morning it had rained heavily, but like a typical day in May in Rome, all at once the sky turned blue. It was 1:30 p.m. and Marco was waiting outside the gate of the school where Beatrice taught. Parents were crowding round, talking amongst themselves. The daily routine had created a kind of bond between them. Marco stood alone, talking to no one. He was nervous, knowing that in a few moments he would be seeing Beatrice again. The first children started coming out, laughing, jumping around, one of them crying, showing the first few teeth in his gummy mouth, all of them 5 old at most, some blonde, some dark, boys and girls together. They were pushing and chasing each other, kissing, saying goodbye. Then they were on their way home, hand in hand with their parents. Then another group of children came out. They were quieter, better behaved and gathered around their adored teacher. One could see in their eyes the effect of their irresistible teacher, so young, so beautiful. As soon as he saw her, Marco too was spellbound. Most of all he recognized her long brown hair and realized that this was Beatrice. His heart beat faster, and when all the children had finally left off besieging her, Marco drew closer to her and asked gravely, "Excuse me, miss, where is my son?" Beatrice looked at him and replied, "Your son? But who is your son?" They came. Quote. She stopped mid-sentence, her mouth fell open in surprise, lost for words. And then, with her eyes shining, "It's you? It's really you? Marco?" Marco replied with a slight nod. They looked at each other again, without breathing. Finally they fell into each other's arms, not caring about whoever may be nearby, parents, children, and in the background, several nuns discreetly watching, moved by and sharing in their joy. Those teenage feeling and mutual physical attraction had not changed a bit with the passing of the years. Perhaps it was increased even more by their desire to make up for lost time, like interest accruing in a bank account, waiting to be spent. Straight away Marco told Beatrice all about the real reason for his return to Rome, and stressed the fact that hanging out with him would be dangerous for her. In reply, Beatrice said that she wanted to start living with him right away, and so she too moved into his house. At last they were a couple. Everything seemed to be going as peaceful as possible. Beatrice got up every morning and went to school, while Marco went to the Rome offices of La Figar. They often spent their evenings in each other's arms in front of the open fire. These magical moments went on for about 6 months. Then, one evening, Marco and Beatrice are in front of the fireplace in the lounge of the farmhouse. They are lying naked with their arms wrapped around each other, talking intimately. Beatrice says, "Let's go to sleep and try to dream the same dream." Marco pretends to start snoring, but at that moment a gunshot shatters the silence of the room and a vase on the mantelpiece explodes. Marco realizes that the Secret Service have tracked him down. There is terror in his eyes, above all for Beatrice, who has never had anything to do with the virus affair. He would never be able to forgive himself if anything happened to her. More shots ring out in the silence of the tragic evening. Marco throws himself on the top of Beatrice to shield her body with his own, hopping to protect her from the deadly bullets. Beatrice is sobbing. Marco repeats over and over again, "Don't worry, baby, don't worry, baby. Everything's gonna be okay." Everything seems destined to a tragic end, when all of a sudden a whirl of strange yellow light appears, spinning round and round. Then, unclear at first, but then more defined, it reveals a small human figure, about 4 feet tall, squat and awkward, with thick, round, green glasses. Marco and Beatrice are twice as terrified. This is certainly not the time to be having a metaphysical experience. The little man introduces himself as Marilyn and says that he is a natural phenomenon which appears to living beings only once in their lifetime, and that this always happens an hour before the death of each individual. At this point their terror triples, their eyes widen and their faces are white. Marilyn calms them down by saying that he is not there to frighten them but to make them happy. In fact, they can ask him for whatever they want and he will make it come true. Marco immediately asks that they be taken away from this horrible and unwelcome situation. Marilyn obeys and transports them away in a whirl of light, adding, though, that it is just a temporary respite, because at the end of that fatal hour they will still die. Now that they are at last far from these dramatic events, Marilyn asks them why they found themselves in such dire straits. Although he knows everything about everyone, he can't know what happens in the last 3 days of the person's life, because it is that person that has to tell him. Marco, trusting Marilyn completely, tells him everything. Marilyn scratches his chin and replies, "You see what interfering with the course of history has led to? It doesn't matter whether your actions are motivated by good or evil. I just mean that in an hour you will unfortunately have to die. Your future is like a movie, each scene of which has already been filmed. And however much you run, or cry or do anything, there is nothing you can do to prevent that which already is." As suddenly as he had appeared, Marilyn wraps himself up in another spiral of yellow light and is swallowed up in nothing. Marco and Beatrice find themselves in the farmhouse again, where they had been 59 minutes earlier. Fresh gunfire rips through the air. Marco and Beatrice are at the end of their tether. Suddenly the door of the house bursts off its hinges. 5 masked men dressed in black come rushing in and start shooting at the 2 young naked bodies, which fall dead to the ground in a pool of blood, still holding hands. At last all is still. The night gives way to dawn. A cockerel crows. Marco and Beatrice stretch and wake up. They had only fallen asleep and really had dreamt the same terrible dream. Beatrice went to get up and knocked her foot against something. She looked to see what it is and discovers, at her feet, a pair of thick round green glasses which remind her of something or someone.